Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. On a September morning in 1922, two young people walking near a lover's lane outside New Brunswick, New Jersey, noticed something beneath a crabapple tree. At first, the scene almost looked peaceful. A man and a woman lay side by side on the ground, their bodies carefully arranged. But as the pair moved closer, the truth became unmistakable. The man and woman were dead, and the love letters scattered around them suggested a story that would soon consume the country. The victims were Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, an Episcopal rector, and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills, a singer in his church choir. Both were married, though not to each other. Their relationship had crossed the boundaries of friendship and pastoral care. Surviving letters document an intimate affair, filled with affection, longing, and plans for a possible future together. Whoever left those letters around the bodies had placed the couple's private life on display. Turning secrecy into public evidence, Hall had been shot once. Eleanor had been shot 3 times, and her throat had suffered a severe wound. The difference in violence would become one of the case's most haunting details. Did it reflect greater anger toward Eleanor? Was the wound meant as punishment, or simply to make certain she was dead? Those questions have followed the case for more than a century. But the condition of the crime scene made reliable answers far harder to find. So let's back up a second. Edward Hall was the rector of the Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist in New Brunswick. He was educated, socially established, and married to Frances Noel Stevens Hall, a woman from a wealthy and prominent local family. Eleanor Mills lived a far more modest life. She was married to James Mills, who worked at the church, and she sang in the choir. Through the congregation, Eleanor and Edward spent increasing amounts of time together. Their correspondence shows that this was not merely gossip invented after their deaths. The affair was real, sustained, and emotionally serious. They wrote about their feelings and about being together while returning each day to their respective spouses and households. In a close church community, maintaining that separation would have required care. Yet secrets have a way of creating patterns: unexplained meetings, guarded conversations, sudden errands. People around them may not have known everything, but some had grown suspicious. On the evening of September 14, 1922, both Hall and Eleanor left home. Accounts of their departures varied, and later testimony would become tangled with rumor. What is clear is that neither returned that night. Their spouses soon realized they were missing. Frances Hall and members of her family made inquiries, while James Mills tried to determine where Eleanor had gone. At that point, it was still possible to imagine an elopement rather than a murder. That possibility mattered because Hall and Eleanor apparently had discussed leaving their existing lives. If they had run away together, embarrassment and scandal would follow, especially for a rector. But the absence lasted through the next day without a confirmed message from either of them. Then, on the morning of September 16th, their bodies were found near an isolated lane on the edge of farmland. Across the jurisdictional boundary from New Brunswick, almost immediately the investigation began to fracture. The bodies lay beneath a crabapple tree, close enough to suggest deliberate placement rather than two people collapsing independently. Hall's hat had been positioned near or over part of his face. The couple's clothing and posture drew careful attention from witnesses. Between and around them were personal papers, including intimate letters. Nothing about that arrangement felt accidental. Someone appeared to have wanted the victims identified not only by name, but by the relationship they had tried to conceal. Now here's where it gets strange, though perhaps not surprising for the period. The location quickly attracted neighbors, reporters, amateur investigators, and people who simply wanted to see the famous murder scene. There was no effective perimeter. Visitors walked through the grass, stood close to the bodies, handled objects, and disturbed possible traces. Some even cut pieces from the crabapple tree to keep as souvenirs. Before forensic work could properly begin, the scene had become a public attraction. Try to imagine investigating a double murder after that. Footprints no longer mean very much when dozens of spectators have crossed the ground. A misplaced object might have been moved by the killer, a reporter, or a curious local resident. Fibers, cigarette remains, impressions, and other fragile evidence could be contaminated or lost. Fingerprint science existed, but it depended on usable surfaces and disciplined handling. The case began with a dramatic tableau, yet much of its physical meaning was destroyed almost at once. Jurisdiction created another problem. The victims lived and worked in New Brunswick in Middlesex County, but the bodies were discovered in neighboring Somerset County. Officials from different agencies became involved, and coordination was uneven. Information passed through multiple hands. Witnesses repeated stories to police, prosecutors, and journalists, sometimes changing details along the way. Instead of one controlled inquiry, there were overlapping investigations unfolding beneath intense public scrutiny. That confusion would later give both prosecutors and defense attorneys plenty to argue about. Suspicion naturally turned toward the people closest to the victims. James Mills had lost his wife and learned publicly that she had been involved with the rector. Frances Hall had lost her husband under the same humiliating circumstances. Francis's brothers also came under attention because of their loyalty to the family and because investigators wondered whether they might have helped confront the couple. But suspicion is not proof. And the contaminated scene offered no clean path from motive to a specific killer. The violence against Eleanor seemed especially personal. Hall had suffered a single gunshot wound, while Eleanor had been shot repeatedly and wounded across the throat. Some observers interpreted that as rage directed toward the woman in the affair. Others suggested the injuries might have been intended to silence her symbolically, but those are interpretations, not findings. A wound can reveal the mechanics of an attack more reliably than the attacker's emotions. Even so, the difference between the victims shaped nearly every theory that followed. The letters created their own puzzle. If robbery had been the motive, why leave documents exposing the affair? If the killer acted in jealous anger, perhaps the letters were displayed to shame the victims. Or perhaps they had been removed from a bag or pocket during a search and scattered without symbolic intent. Investigators and newspapers often treated the placement as a message, yet because the scene was so badly disturbed, it remains difficult to know precisely how every paper originally lay. Newspapers seized on the combination of religion, wealth, adultery, and murder. Reporters arrived from beyond New Jersey, and the case became national entertainment as well as local tragedy. Headlines often moved faster than verified evidence. Private correspondence was quoted and analyzed for hidden meaning. Witnesses found themselves surrounded by journalists offering attention and, in some instances, money for exclusive information. The public did not merely follow the investigation. Its appetite helped shape the environment in which the investigation operated. Early investigators interviewed relatives, church associates, neighbors, and people who might have traveled near the lane. Timelines were assembled from recollections about telephone calls, household movements, vehicles, and sounds heard in the night. But memories were already being influenced by published stories. One person's tentative observation could become firm certainty after repetition. The central question remained simple: who knew Hall and Eleanor would meet there? The available answers, however, were anything but simple. Frances Hall denied involvement. Her position was that she had not gone to the meeting place and had not participated in any confrontation. Her brothers likewise denied taking part in the killings. Prosecutors faced the challenge of proving not just that the family had reason to resent the affair, but that particular people had traveled to the scene and committed or assisted in murder. Without trustworthy physical evidence, the case depended heavily on witness statements and reconstructed movements. The first major legal effort went nowhere. Evidence was presented to a grand jury, but no indictments followed. That did not establish anyone's innocence in a final sense. A grand jury decides whether enough evidence exists to bring charges, not whether a defendant is guilty. Still, the refusal to indict exposed the weakness of the case. For several years, the Hall Mills murders remained officially unresolved, even as newspapers and private citizens continued debating possible suspects. Then in 1926, the investigation was revived. Political pressure, renewed publicity, and claims of overlooked testimony brought the old evidence back into circulation. 4 years had passed. That is a long time for witnesses to preserve exact memories, especially after repeated interviews and constant press coverage. Authorities revisited statements, examined records, and exhumed remains for additional medical review. The renewed inquiry promised a breakthrough, but it also magnified every weakness inherited from the original investigation. The revived prosecution centered on Frances Hall and 2 of her brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens. The theory was that members of the Stevens family had discovered the lovers' meeting and confronted them. Another relative also became entangled in the legal proceedings. Though the principal trial focused on Frances, Henry, and Willie, prosecutors portrayed the killings as a family response to scandal and betrayal. The defense argued that the state had built a dramatic story around unreliable evidence. The prosecution's most famous witness was Jane Gibson, a local woman whom newspapers crudely nicknamed the Pig Woman because she raised hogs. Gibson claimed she had been near the area on the night of the murders and had witnessed a confrontation. Her account placed members of the Hall family party at the scene. If accepted, her testimony could connect motive to presence, but her story had shifted over time, and the circumstances surrounding her statements raised serious doubts. Gibson was gravely ill by the time of the trial. In one of the proceedings' most theatrical moments, she was brought in on a hospital bed to testify. The image was powerful, a sick witness naming people accused of a notorious double murder. But courtroom drama is not the same thing as reliability. Defense attorneys challenged inconsistencies in her accounts, her ability to observe events in darkness, and the influence of publicity. Jurors had to decide whether she was an eyewitness or an unstable storyteller. Other witnesses attempted to establish movements, conversations, and suspicious behavior before or after the killings. Yet many details had been filtered through 4 years of rumor. The prosecution lacked a murder weapon conclusively tied to the defendants. It lacked uncontaminated traces placing them beneath the tree. Even the medical evidence, though important in establishing how the victims died, could not identify who had attacked them. The case therefore rested on combining motive, circumstance, and disputed testimony into one narrative. The defense pulled that narrative apart piece by piece. It emphasized mistakes at the crime scene, conflicts among witnesses, and the absence of dependable physical proof. It also attacked the idea that family outrage automatically implied murder. Frances Hall may have had a motive to feel humiliated or betrayed, but many people experience those emotions without committing violence. The legal question was narrower. Had the state proved beyond a reasonable doubt that these defendants were responsible? The defense insisted it had not. Willie Stevens presented another complication. Contemporary descriptions often treated him as eccentric, and both the press and courtroom observers scrutinized his behavior. But unusual mannerisms do not establish guilt. In a heavily publicized trial, personality can become a substitute for evidence, especially when a defendant does not react as spectators expect. The jury had to separate impressions from facts. That was difficult in a case where newspapers had already transformed nearly everyone involved into a recognizable character. The trial took place in Somerville, New Jersey, amid enormous media attention. Crowds followed the testimony, while reporters described the defendants' clothing, expressions, and interactions. The murders were no longer simply a police matter. They had become a cultural spectacle involving class, marriage, religion, and forbidden intimacy. The actual victims could almost disappear beneath that coverage. Edward and Eleanor were discussed as symbols of scandal, though each had been a person with a family, routines, hopes, and contradictions. After weeks of testimony, the jury acquitted Frances Hall and her brothers. Legally, the prosecution had failed to prove its case. The acquittals did not solve the murders, and no alternative suspect was convicted. The courtroom had produced a verdict about the accused, not an answer about the killer. From that point forward, theories continued to circle the same damaged evidence: a jealous spouse, protective relatives, an unknown assailant, or some combination of people whose roles were never uncovered. There is also a caution here about reading the crime scene too confidently. The bodies appeared carefully positioned, and the letters seemed deliberately displayed, but we know the site was entered by spectators before proper documentation was complete. Some details may reflect the killer's actions, others may reflect later disturbance. Once that distinction is lost, a scene can encourage stories that feel coherent without being true. In the Hall Mills case, interpretation often rushed in to fill the space where preserved evidence should have been. Today, the case survives through more than old headlines. Rutgers University collections preserve correspondence, police material, autopsy records, legal files, photographs, and trial documents connected to the investigation. Those archives allow researchers to compare public claims with surviving records and to hear as much as possible the voices of people involved. They also reveal how evidence changes meaning as it moves from a private letter to a police file to a newspaper column, and finally into historical memory. But archives have limits. A document can preserve what someone said without proving that the statement was accurate. An autopsy can describe wounds without naming the hand that caused them. A love letter can establish intimacy without showing who knew about a planned meeting. The surviving material gives us pieces, some remarkably detailed, but not the missing connection that would turn suspicion into certainty. That gap is why responsible accounts of the case must resist declaring a favored suspect guilty. More than a century later, the image beneath the Crabapple tree still holds attention. Two bodies laid together, private letters exposed around them, and a community gathering before the ground had even been protected. It is tempting to believe that one overlooked clue must contain the answer. Maybe it once did, but evidence can be permanently erased by footsteps, careless handling, fading memory, and publicity. The identity of whoever killed Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills remains unknown, leaving the letters to document their affair, but not their final moments. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.